Streaming. Wait for the stream to come up. There it is. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahayi Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahayi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Very good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to the many students watching or attending this satsang online. We have a lot of great questions, as always. We'll start with online questions, and then we'll take some questions from our local students. First question here. This is all working? No, looks okay. All right. First question here is from Radhika, who lives in Tiruvananthapuram. She says, we offer ghee, oil, flowers, etc. at temples. How do these offerings work with Ishvara? And how does one become better than another? So is it better to, if you're making offerings at an altar, sometimes we just offer this akshata, this yellowed rice, sometimes flowers, sometimes very costly things. Does it make any difference to Ishvara? Does he have preferences? He says, if you're going to offer ghee, I suppose Ishvara wants pure desi ghee. That's what the bottle says, right? So it makes no difference at all to Ishvara. It makes a difference to you. And the basic principle of making any offering is something that's valuable to you. That's it. The more valuable it is. So how about flowers that are old and dried versus very beautiful, fresh flowers? Which is more valuable to you? Simple. That's it. So you offer something of value. How does it work for Ishvara? It's tricky because in prayers, in fact, even in a typical sankalpa, we say Ishvara prityartham, for the sake of pleasing Ishvara. Can Ishvara be displeased? So if you offer the dried flower, Ishvara is going to, hey, I'm sorry, I'm in a mood. What are you doing? I shouldn't be so silly. Okay. So it is a metaphor. So the rituals of puja and homa and havan are highly symbolic, metaphoric. So we use human-like symbology, but Ishvara is clearly not a human being and not pleased through our offerings like a human being might be pleased. From the point of view of someone who is seeking moksha, won't these offerings foster attachment to results? Attachment to results. So you're doing the ritual to pay off Ishvara, convince Ishvara to give you some special blessing. That's not a very healthy attitude at all towards puja. Someone who is really devoted is offering out of love, not out of attachment. So if there is attachment to results, that's not bhakti. That's, the offerings are not bhakti if they're done with attachment to results. Those offerings are not bhakti, they are bhakshish. Right? You're paying off Ishvara to get what you want. And nothing devotional in that at all. Okay. Then, next question from Ayush. Ayush in India. He says, this is good, Ramayana is supposed to teach us about dharma. But wasn't it adharmic? Or wasn't it himsa? When he's referring to the Ramayana. In the Ramayana, the Vanaras, the monkeys, so to speak, burnt Lanka in their invasion, massacring thousands of civilians, including women and children. It was pretty bad. In the Mahabharata, we find another really awful war. So Mahabharata and Ramayana are indeed, as Ayush says, they're supposed to teach us dharma, but then why all of this violence if they're trying? Himsa. We say ahimsa paramo dharma. The main principle of dharma is ahimsa, but Ramayana and especially Mahabharata filled with himsa. How do we reconcile that? It's a teaching. And we have to understand teaching for what it is. So I thought about this before. Try this example. I've never used it before, but I think it works. Suppose you're back in your school days in a chemistry class, and your chemistry professor is teaching you that these two chemicals mixed together will react violently. Violence, himsa. So, and then to make the point, your professor has a glass enclosure, reinforced or plexiglass, a safe enclosure, and with a small amount of each chemical, mixes them together, resulting in a small contained explosion. Himsa, violence. Now, notice when the professor is doing that, is he teaching you should mix these chemicals together? In fact, he's teaching you the opposite. What he's showing you is the consequence of mixing these two chemicals together. So you're not supposed to emulate the professor when he's giving you a counterexample, right? That's how the Ramayana and Mahabharata teach us. There's so many stories of terrible violence, and what those stories show us is the consequence of violence. They're not teaching you to do violence. They're teaching you the consequence of violence. And you have to admit, if those stories weren't there, if you didn't see in those scriptures the consequence of violence, those scriptures would not be as effective. So we need to have the counterexample. This is not made for imitation, so to speak. Next question from Stefano. Stefano lives in Spain. Nice. Stefano says, my mind/ego/intellect wants to understand Atma, but as we all understand, my true nature is beyond words, ungraspable, beyond human understanding. By the way, that expression is a little problematic. Beyond human understanding. You can't understand Atma as an object. You can understand Atma as your true nature. So to say beyond human understanding is not quite right. Atma is not an object you can understand like any other object, but you can understand Atma as the consciousness that reveals all your experiences. Okay. Stefano goes on to say, when I meditate, I can sometimes make my mind quiet. I feel aware of the stillness in my mind. But this awareness in meditation is misleading, because if pure consciousness is left, then there's no I-ness, there is no experience. I think the next statement will help. It's impossible to feel Atma. right or wrong? Correct? Yep. Atma is not something you feel. What does Atma feel like? That feels nice. Atma is not something you can feel. Okay, and Stefano understands that quite well. So, therefore, trying to feel or experience Atma, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, would be like trying to see your eyes with your eyes. Good. Can you clarify and give a suggestion of how to get rid of the ego, which is a little different than what he's saying? So in deep meditation, it's very clear that Atma is not an object you will one day experience in deep meditation, because Atma is the experiencer and not the experienced. This is clear. Now, he's referring to a state of pure consciousness. Pure consciousness, pure in the sense of nothing but consciousness. Pure consciousness is basically consciousness minus mind. Consciousness with a perfectly still mind. If the mind is perfectly still, there's no ego. There's no meditator. In fact, let me just make reference to something here. This particular topic is very deep, and I'm going to give a brief explanation now. But if you want to understand this more clearly, I have a series of 4 videos called The Psychology of Samadhi, which goes into all of this in great detail. So I'll give a brief explanation here, but for a complete explanation, please watch those 4 videos, Psychology of Samadhi. But here, suppose, let me try to capture the essence of what those 4 videos teach. One part of it says that as your mind becomes increasingly quiet, suppose you're meditating on something. You're meditating on your breath, you're meditating on a mantra. At some point, you will be so absorbed that whatever you're meditating on will go away. So if you're meditating on the mantra goes away. If you're meditating on the breath, you're no longer aware of your breathing. You're still meditating. So you're meditating and meditating, the breath goes away, the mantra goes away, I'm meditating. What's still present is ego, because you're still a meditator. If you feel, and by the way, ahankara is better understood as a feeling, the feeling of individuality. You know, we call it ego, we call it ahankara, we call it the I thought. All of that to me is very conceptual and in a way not as helpful as it would be. To feel like you, to feel like an individual conscious being is ego or ahankara. So at one point you're meditating and you feel like you're meditating. You feel like the meditator. And it's a wonderful feeling. You feel like a meditator and there's nothing else. It's a very peaceful, quiet, wonderful situation. But there's one more, not just one, but there's another step, so to speak, and this is what's discussed at some length in that series of videos, and that is the feeling of being a meditator can also go away. So suppose you are meditating, the mantra goes away, the breath goes away, everything goes away, you're meditating, and then after a while, you're not meditating. Meditation seems to come to an end. In fact, meditation does come to an end. Meditation is a mental activity, is it not? When your mind isn't doing anything, is it meditating? When your mind is perfectly silent? You can't say it's meditating. In fact, in that series of videos, what I describe is there's the momentum of practice leads to the effortless stillness. I don't want to get into all this. Really, watch the video. The effort of practice leads to effortless stillness. That effortless stillness is one kind of samadhi. So you're no longer meditating. How does it feel? Well, to feel something, you feel something, right? There has to be something to be felt. Can you feel nothing? I'm pantomiming to make a point. You can't feel nothing. So in that condition, when your mind is perfectly silent, it's a kind of samadhi, there's no feeling. Is there an experience? Yes, but not an experience of. There is experience, and this is something you'll have to get used to. Experience without an object. It just means pure consciousness, pure awareness. Experience without an experiencer, without an experienced. Pure consciousness. Now, it gets more interesting when that state comes to an end. Because when it comes to an end, then you've had an experience of without an object, without an experiencer, and because you were awake, if you fall asleep, none of this works. So in that condition, when your mind is perfectly silent, you're awake, which means that experience is in your memory. After the fact, you can reflect on the experience you had when your mind was perfectly still. After the fact. Obviously, when your mind is still, you can't do anything. After the stillness is over, then you have an opportunity to reflect. And this is the main use of meditation, the main use of this form of meditation in Advaita Vedanta is exactly that. To give you that experience, an experience without an experiencer or an object of experience, which simply means to have a perfectly silent mind. We can learn a lot from that kind of meditation. And again, that series of videos will explain that all in a lot of detail. Another question here from Roshan. I'm sorry, this is from Shreya. And Shreya lives in Canada, and she says, I see Advaita Vedanta as the best explanation from a religious standpoint about the causality of the universe. So a good explanation. However, I have been doing science all my life. So she says I have a scientific mindset. And and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, as a result of my she says, I'm having a hard time realizing that my true nature is Brahman through Tattvamasi. Even though I do meditation, can you help me see a different perspective? So she has a scientific perspective. Nothing wrong. By the way, I also have a scientific perspective. Not my only perspective, but it's helpful to adopt sometimes a scientific perspective. Of course, the scientific perspective has a fundamental limitation. And a fundamental limitation of a scientific perspective is that science starts with observation. All science. Starts with observation. So the limitation of science is that it's limited to that which is observable. What is observable? Everything in the world. And it's interesting. Some things we observe indirectly. Like up until recent times, atoms could only be observed indirectly. By the way, they can actually be visualized now. The technology has gone to such an extreme where individual atoms can be visualized. It's mind-boggling. Anyway, science deals with the observable, that which you can observe directly or indirectly. We can observe our body directly. Indirectly, suppose you want to know something about your kidneys. Directly or maybe better to open up a book on anatomy instead of directly means what? I'm being silly, sorry. So, observation, you can observe your mind directly. Observe your thoughts, emotions. Can you observe consciousness? Can you observe the observer? This is where the scientific perspective breaks down. A funny image I hold in my mind is the scientist, to take a scientific perspective to Vedanta is like a scientist looking through a microscope, very prototypically scientific thing. So she's looking through her microscope. What is she looking for? She's looking for the observer. What is the problem? The observer isn't on that side of the lens. The observer is on this side of the lens. And this shows the limitation of scientific perspective. Vedanta is based on a very fundamental practice called atma vichara, self-inquiry. Self-inquiry means your attention is turned away from the world around you and turned within. Within how? Well, body is a start, but then further in, and further, and further, and further. Of course, it's helpful to have some guidance in that process of self-inquiry, which is why we have Advaita Vedantic teachings and we have gurus. So with all of that help, that process of self-inquiry becomes fruitful. So self-inquiry is distinctly different perspective than a scientific perspective. If you approach Advaita Vedanta with a scientific perspective, it just doesn't work. You have to drop that perspective and adopt this very personal perspective of self-inquiry. Okay. Do we have any questions here? And we'll start in back. And here, you may not show.
Namaste, Swamiji. I'm referring to Mandana Mishra's argument. When I was a kid in India, and we were taught sayings like a stitch in time saves nine, or a rolling stone gathers no moss, and you'd sit there thinking, and I asked, well, what does that mean? And the teachers and even my mother would say, you don't need to know that. You're 5, you will figure it out. And in fact, that sort of happened. It took me a while.
It happens because they're embarrassed to admit they don't know.
Right, especially stitch and tie. Anyway, so in India at least, memorization and repetition are really given a lot of emphasis in studying. And today, people are beginning to realize the reason Indians are so good at certain mathematics and so on is because they memorize without literally understanding. So I'm wondering if Mandana Mishra's his belief that if you keep on repeating Aham Brahmasmi, repeating, it'll finally dawn on you similarly.
What is the basis for that, though?
It's a practice.
It's an assumption you've made.
Right.
So there's
it
no
was
basis.
Culturally, was it a cultural thing
Oh, so that's your question. Is rote learning
right.
a cultural phenomenon in India? Looks that way.
That can lead to results.
Right.
So maybe he thought you could get enlightened
at
some point.
He lived 1,200 years ago. This concept of rote learning is more of a modern concept. Also, learning applies to information. Come back here. Catch me if I forget that. Learning applies to information, and we've had this discussion before, and that is, if you learn Advaita Vedanta, if you gain all the information compiled in the scriptures, if you memorize all the scriptures, rote learning, you're wasting your time. Absolutely wasting your time. As we just discussed, it's all about self-inquiry. It's not about learning facts, which is what modern education is all about. Modern education is about learning specific bits of information because that information is valuable. In Advaita Vedanta, information is not valuable. Self-inquiry is valuable. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Other questions here? In front.
So I was thinking about the Uddhava Gita yesterday, and sometimes you know how like some people can hold on to something for like 10 years or something. You were discussing that.
Hurt.
Yes.
Hold on to hurt for 10 years, yes.
So they got me thinking, like, what if like if I apologize in all my interactions with people, so that I don't want to be the person to be the cause of that, like, in that sense.
Good.
But the thing is that that would kind of be awkward. So then I was like, maybe I could like practice right speech. But the thing is that, is there really what's the best way to go around so that I don't be that person?
Okay. Is it possible, let me try to rephrase your question. Is it possible to live a life without being hurt or causing hurt? How would you answer that question? It's impossible. So just in ordinary interactions, it's inevitable. We are going to make some mistakes that hurt others. Others are going to make mistakes that hurt us. And that'll continue as long as we live. So then the issue then, of course we want to minimize it. Naturally we want to minimize it. We want to avoid being mistakes, avoid making mistakes as much as we can. And we want to avoid getting hurt. So we act responsibly so that we cause as little hurt to others, and we submit ourselves to being hurt by others as little as possible. It's still going to happen. So then what we were discussing is how to manage that hurt. And that's where psychology comes in, that's where Vedanta has a role. So we can't avoid, we do our best. And is there anyone who never makes a mistake? So we all make mistakes, and some of those mistakes hurt others. Some of those mistakes hurt others a lot. So now think about, and this is part of our discussion from yesterday's class, if some of your mistakes caused a lot of hurt, how about the people who have hurt you? Isn't that also the result of a mistake? You're not perfect, you make mistakes. Some of those mistakes cause a lot of hurt. The person who hurt you made a mistake, and it caused a lot of hurt. That's how life works, and we have to learn how to deal with that. Okay, any other questions here? One more question here. You need the microphone.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on her question. Maybe I misunderstand something, because from my perspective, it also seemed very similar what Shankara and Mishra were saying. And on Nididhyasana, the Hatma Buddhi, the translation that I understood is habitual misidentification.
Habitual identification with the body and mind.
Okay. Now my question is the following, because a habit is dealt or created or changed by repetition. So I understood that Misra, he said, okay, this is an indirect knowledge, you have to deal with doubt, and by repetition you would overcome habitual misidentification.
That's what Shankara teaches. That's not what Mandana Mishra teaches.
So, because on Shankara's side, it had the same...
That's exactly what Shankara teaches. Mandana Mishra teaches that repetition is necessary to convert indirect knowledge into direct knowledge. So it's a different teaching. And we'll see there's a lot more. We've just began our discussion. We'll see a lot more of that.
Thank you.
Forward. Okay, one more question here, please.
Swamiji, during meditation, reach a stage where you see completely blank, dark. What is it? It is after that we have to carry on having mantra, japa, or just leave it as it is.
It depends.
I feel blank, completely blank.
Right. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
So there are hundreds of ways of meditating, which have different purposes. So what are we trying to accomplish with a given meditation technique? So by the way, if you practice meditation, can I ask a stupid question? If you practice meditation, why? What are you trying to accomplish? And I'm not being facetious, because if you're not clear about what you're trying to accomplish, then isn't it a little silly to do something without being clear about what it is you want to accomplish? Now, you're actually talking about a very sophisticated kind of meditation. If you're talking about a simple kind of meditation, you can just go on reciting a mantra, fine. And you say, I want to quiet my mind. That's a goal. And for the sake of quieting my mind, I'm reciting this mantra. So that's a very simple goal with a very simple technique. You've described now a very sophisticated meditation. When your mind, you call it blank, I would call it quiet. That's not a beginning practice, right?
No.
That's a very sophisticated practice, which means one who is practicing that would have very sophisticated goals. If it's an advanced technique, there would be very advanced goals. Obviously, that person has learned to manage his or her mind long before, has practiced meditation for years and years and years, so they're after something much more. And from a Vedantic standpoint, when the mind is perfectly silent, all that remains is consciousness, and it helps you understand who you are as pure consciousness. That's a very sophisticated topic. Most meditators aren't quite there, so we deal with more the mechanics of using meditation to train the mind, to quiet the mind, to calm the mind. I want to follow up, please.
Because when I start, I do prana vikshana.
Oh, wrong one. Sorry.
And concentration of mind. During that time, I feel blank, but after that, I get sakshi bhava. I do the meditation sakshi bhava.
Okay.
So during that time, I completely blank. It's a dark thing, it looks like.
Okay.
So,
That's something else. The way first of all, I don't know. I don't have, your experience is yours. I have no way of knowing exactly what you're experiencing. But from your description, it sounds like what is called jada samadhi. Jada samadhi is when darkness overtakes the mind. It's a state of, you yourself, you use the word darkness. And darkness is tamas, actually. So the mind gets covered by darkness, by tamas. It's a state in which there's no active thinking. Active thinking, after all, is rajasic. So this happens to many people. And especially it can happen if you don't get enough rest, if you're tired and you meditate. It's very easy to fall into that condition where your mind is just quiet, but it's not a quiet full of light. It's a kind of quiet which is dark. And so that's often called jada samadhi, a state when the mind is overtaken by darkness, overtaken by tamas. So if that happens to you, it means you have to wake up your mind. It means you need a more vigorous, active kind of meditation to shake you out of that dullness. So if you're finding yourself dull, then maybe that's not the right meditation technique for you. Maybe you need to do a technique that's a little more active to keep your mind from sliding off into that darkness. Does that help a little bit? Yeah. Okay, good. Let's take some more questions online here. We have next question. Let's see, that was from Shreya. Next question is from Amit. Amit is in India. He says, we hear that God, Ishvara, takes the form of an avatara when adharma increases. As in Bhagavad Gita, it says, yada yada hi dharmasya. Interesting that those two verses are famous because of a TV series. Those two verses of the Bhagavad Gita, most people who lived in India during the 80s, they all know those two verses. They heard those two verses 96 times. There were 96 episodes in V.R. Chopra's Mahabharata. I've also watched it. Nice. Okay. So, Ishvara, or let's be a little bit more specific. We'll say Vishnu takes an avatara, takes a form when adharma increases. That's what it says in the Bhagavad Gita. But doesn't that mean that the law of karma is not perfect? Because it cannot mete out the phala, the fruits of actions, properly, and therefore adharma slowly keeps increasing in spite of Ishvara's laws. In other words, Ishvara, being karma paladatta, has to come down as his laws get bypassed by people. This avatara vada is something that's usually not well understood. And it has to be understood according to the doctrine of karma. So we have to look at avatara from the standpoint of the doctrine of karma. First of all, the error in thinking here is that the increase of adharma is not within Ishvara's laws. That's an assumption made here, right? So adharma goes on increase. Let me put some silly words in Amit's mouth. Amit's question is very thoughtful. I'm going to make it sound silly intentionally. And that is, Ishvara is up there in some heavenly domain, and he sees things getting worse and worse and worse, and he says, oh my God, I blew it. I didn't create the laws of the universe correctly, so I better take a form and incarnate so I can fix things. That's not exactly what Amit is saying, but it sort of makes a point. Ishvara makes no mistakes. The increase Let's look at it. Is the increase of adharma natural or unnatural? It happens, right? Just like we were having a discussion the other day about how world cultures in every country were getting more and more divisive. We're seeing more divisiveness. Is it natural or unnatural? Pendulum swing. Right now, the pendulum has swung towards divisiveness. Hopefully, before long, sooner is better, the pendulum will swing in the other direction. How about adharma? Pendulum can swing towards adharma. Natural. Pendulum will also swing towards dharma. Natural. So the increase of adharma, which prompts Ishvara to take an avatara, an incarnation, is natural. It's all part of the law of karma. Further, the presence of an avatara itself is a result of karma. Here's a little bit of avatara vada, properly understood. This isn't really taught much, but I think you'll find it makes sense. Do you think Ishvara, I was being very facetious before, Ishvara says, wow, what a mess, I better go and clean it up. That doesn't sound right at all. Ishvara is like a human being who has an individual will. He's judging the condition of what's happening, and he takes a willful decision. That's very human, that behavior. And this is a common problem. We superimpose human traits on Ishvara, who is not a human being. We have to grow out of that. If you really want to understand who Ishvara is, you have to stop. The fancy word is anthropomorphizing, superimposing a human form on Ishvara. So why does Ishvara incarnate when adharma increases? It's not an act of will. Willful actions belong to human beings. Willful actions do not belong to the God of the cosmos. Then how do we understand the avatara? Well, we understand Ishvara as karma paladatta, as the one who makes manifest the results of our deeds. Right? We all understand that. Now watch this. It's very simple, but a nice explanation. When things get really bad, do people pray more or less? They pray more. So those prayers are karmas. Those karmas will have a bigger effect. And what is the effect? When enough people are suffering enough and praying so much, the cumulative effect of their prayers might culminate in the birth of an avatara. So the birth of an avatara is due to our karma, not Ishvara's. Ishvara doesn't have karma. Ishvara gets born because of karma. That doesn't make sense at all. So this avatara vada is the technical understanding of how and why Ishvara takes the form of an avatara, and it's understood properly through the doctrine of karma, and that is an avatara is born because of our prayers, and at times when things are especially bad, we pray more, so it's more likely that when things get very adharmic, an avatara will come forth. That's an answer to Amit's question. Next question is from Simon. Simon lives in UK. Nice. Can you please explain Ishvara some more? Well, that's good follow-up to what we just discussed. If I understand correctly, Ishvara is Brahman plus Maya. Maybe, I know I've used that very expression. It's not Brahman in the presence of Maya. So just to get a little better, a little more nuanced understanding here. Brahman in the presence of Maya is Ishvara, creator, sustainer, destroyer. But to Simon, he says, but it's still impersonal. Ishvara is impersonal. This word impersonal, by the way, is a word that's very commonly used by members of ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement, who are highly critical of Shankara's teachings, Advaita Vedanta. They call it all impersonalism, because instead of, we're not worshipping the divine person of the Godhead, which is Sri Krishna. Their kind of language. And I don't mean to be critical, but it is what it is. Is Ishvara not a person? The criticism here, Ishvara is definitely not Sri Krishna as that particular avatara, which is to say that in Advaita Vedanta, Ishvara has no form. That's true. Sri Krishna is a particular form. The word Ishvara does not imply a particular form. Of course, if we are accustomed to symbolism, we can worship that Ishvara in any form. That which is formless, we can imagine in any form. That which has a form, you can't imagine. So you can't worship Sri Krishna as Devi. Sri Krishna is Sri Krishna. Devi is Devi. You can't worship Sri Krishna as Devi. But you can worship Ishvara as Sri Krishna, as Devi, as Ganesha, as any deity. So that which is formless is available for worship in many forms. This is the Vedantic approach to worship. But now the question, and I think this is what Simon's question is getting at, is Ishvara impersonal? So Ishvara is not an avatara, so that's first thing, but many deities in the Hindu traditions are not. In fact, most deities in the Hindu tradition are not avatars. Vishnu is not an avatara. Devi is not an avatara. Shiva is not an avatara, etc., etc. So Sri Krishna is one particular form or avatara, and very definitely personal. Certain form, certain history, life story, which is wonderful. So the question is Ishvara a person? And the answer depends on how you define person. If you define person as the divine personality of the Godhead, Sri Krishna, then obviously not. But if you define person as a conscious being, Ishvara is a conscious being. Ishvara has a body. You know that Ishvara has a body? The entire cosmos is Ishvara's body. Ishvara has a mind. What is that mind? The intelligence that pervades the universe. Ishvara has thoughts. What are those thoughts? The function of nature is Ishvara's thoughts. Now, I know this is a little symbolic, but it's not hard to relate to formless Ishvara as a person. Ishvara is formless. Doesn't mean Ishvara is not a conscious being that you can have a personal relationship with. And this is the essence of ISKCON's argument. They argue that you can't have a personal relationship with Ishvara. And one thing they're absolutely right about is having a personal relationship with Ishvara is crucial. Ishvara is not a concept. Ishvara is crucial in prayer. A personal relationship with Ishvara is central to your prayer life. And ISKCON is absolutely correct about that. But it is it's possible because this is my devotional life. I'm sorry, I usually don't like to speak in the first person like this. I have no difficulty whatsoever having a personal, very intense, deep personal relationship with an Ishvara who has no human form. An Ishvara whose body is the cosmos. An Ishvara whose mind are the laws of nature, the intelligence of the universe. I have a very real, powerful relationship with that Ishvara. Doesn't have a human form, doesn't need to have a human form. Ishvara is person, we say cosmic person, Purusha. Okay, take a couple more here. Oh, yeah, some good questions here. Kunal, I think lives in Florida, asks, what is the relationship between pure consciousness and subjective experience? Pure consciousness means just consciousness. Consciousness in the presence of mind is subjective experience. Consciousness in the absence of mind, no subjective experience. So we can say, and this is how Vedanta would explain it. Vedanta would say that just as clay assumes the form of pot, they would say that consciousness in the presence of the mind assumes the form of subjective experience, like thoughts. So I do that again. Just as clay can assume the form of a pot, pure consciousness can assume the form of your thoughts, emotions, perceptions, everything that's part of subjective experience. This question is from Divas in California. How does one who is not yet realized, how does one comprehend the self is in all and all is in the self? Is one way to understand this because consciousness is the light that illumines, and therefore there is consciousness in all and all in it? There's a lot of Vedanta in this issue. And there's some famous verses in the Bhagavad Gita, and Sri Krishna says, I dwell in all. In fact, trying to remember, I think beginning of chapter 7, there's two verses which almost are self-contradictory. Sri Krishna says, if I remember correctly, he says, I dwell in all beings. And in the very next verse, he says, I don't dwell in all beings. They dwell in me. These two statements follow one another, I believe, in the beginning of chapter 7. They're not contradictory, but to understand it takes a lot of Vedanta. And so let me just hint at it. For Devas, the way to understand it is just spend some time with these teachings. There's a lot of teachings that are required to really understand this fully and completely. So let me just hint at it. This is not the right example. Here's a better example. Space is in this room, right? This room is in space. That's it. Space is in this room. This room is in space. Self, which is Atma. Atma is boundaryless, edgeless, limitless. Limitless means all-pervasive, like space. So if we look at all-pervasive space, can we say that all-pervasive space is inside this room? Of course. How would you keep space out of this room? It doesn't make any sense. So that which is all-pervasive is present both inside and outside. And then if we apply that to Atma, Atma dwells, the typical language we use, Atma dwells in every person, and we exist in consciousness. We exist in consciousness because consciousness is all-pervasive. And we get one more question, then we're done. This question comes from Crystal, who lives in Maryland. Crystal asks, would you be willing to discuss a little bit about the term Hinduism as Sanatana Dharma? You know, most of you know that there's a bit of controversy about the word Hinduism, and some people who consider themselves very pious, they say we shouldn't call the religion Hindu because Hindu is not a Sanskrit word. So the word Hindu, most of you know the origin of the word Hindu is the Sindhu River, now called Indus, is in the far west of India. The people who lived on the other side of the Sindhu River ended up being called Hindus. So originally, Hindu was a geographic term, and a geographic term given by the invaders, Arab invaders, not Arab invaders, Mughal invaders, whoever they were, invading India. So it was originally a geographic term, and then it came to be applied over hundreds of years. It came to be applied to the religion. We understand that. By the way, can the meaning of words and symbols change over time? Sometimes we forget this. We get a little rigid. What does this mean? In 1947 and 46, this meant victory. In 1966, it meant peace, man. And I suppose today it can mean anything. I don't know. Today there's that famous picture of Richard Nixon after being thrown out of Washington. He's getting, and in total disgrace, he's getting on his airplane to leave Washington forever. That is the most bizarre picture, I have to say. The point I'm making is symbols are subject to reinterpretation. Words are symbols. Words are subject to redefinition. So in modern times, the word Hinduism has come to be applied to the religion that comes from the Vedas. So is there anything wrong in using it? In my opinion, absolutely not. Now, some people who are a little rigid, they're still saying, no, we should call it Sanatana Dharma. Do you know, that's actually a modern term. Sanatana Dharma is not an ancient term. It probably is about 200 or 300 years old. Maybe more, but it is certainly not an ancient. Look in the Vedas and find one example of the expression Sanatana Dharma. It's not there. Of course, they argue, but word Hindu is not in the Vedas. Fine. Sanatana Dharma is also not in the Vedas, so what kind of argument is that? In fact, the scholarly term for the religion is not Sanatana Dharma, it's Vaidika Dharma. the religion of the Vedas. As I said, the word Sanatana came later. But in ancient times, if you want to refer to the religion that came from the Vedas, the proper term is Vaidika Dharma and not Sanatana Dharma. Is the term Vaidika Dharma in the Vedas? No? Why not? Vaidika, here's just 1 minute of linguistics. I know you're all in love with linguistics, right? Everyone loves to study. I'm being really silly. Okay. But 1 minute of linguistics is important. Vaidika is an adjective. You need an adjective to discern one thing from other similar things. So Vaidika Dharma is different from Jaina Dharma, is different from Bauddha Dharma, is different from Christian Dharma, etc., etc. So, in ancient times, in India, 5,000 years ago, Vedas were present in a early form. So that the Dharma, the religion of the Vedas, was already present 5,000 years ago. What other religion was present in India 5,000 years ago? There was nothing else. If there's nothing to distinguish, then you don't need the adjective. You don't have to call it, first of all, Sanatana came later. You don't even have to call it Vaidika Dharma. It's just Dharma. It's just, and Dharma with the meaning religion. So in the most ancient times, they didn't even call it Vaidika Dharma. They just called it religion. Then, of course, as other religions emerged, then you have to distinguish Vaidika Dharma from Jaina Dharma, from Bauddha Dharma, which came up about 2,500 years ago. But prior to that time, you didn't even need the term Vaidika Dharma, because there was only one religion. Okay, this would be a good place then to conclude our satsang today. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om. That's all. See you next time.